The mansion stood tall on the hill, its windows glimmering with the reflection of the evening sun. From the outside, the house looked like the home of a man who had everything in the world: wealth, power, and comfort. Inside, though, the billionaire sat quietly in his leather chair, lost in his own thoughts. His face carried the look of a man who had seen too much of life. He had built his empire from scratch. He had fought through business wars, competitors who tried to pull him down and partners who betrayed him. Each battle had left a scar on his heart. For years he had told himself that money could buy security, but the truth was, the more wealth he gained, the less trust he had in people. Even the ones who smiled at him, he wondered, did they smile because they cared about him or because they cared about his money? That doubt ate at him every single day. The billionaire was not a cruel man. He was not unkind. But he had grown careful, cautious, even suspicious. When you have billions in the bank, you never really know who is loyal and who is pretending. That was his life now. Comfort all around him, but no peace inside him. On this particular day, he noticed something small but important. His maid, who had worked for him for years, brought her young son with her. She usually avoided doing that, but today she had no choice. The boy's school had closed early, and there was no one else at home to watch over him. The boy was around 10 years old, with curious eyes and an energy that filled the room without him saying a word. He wore a simple red t-shirt and old jeans. His shoes looked worn out, but his face shined with innocence. The billionaire watched the boy quietly. For some reason, the boy reminded him of his own childhood, back when he had nothing but dreams and a hunger to change his life. He wondered, what kind of man will this boy grow up to be? And then an idea struck him. The billionaire had tested business partners before. He had tested employees. He had tested friends, but he had never tested a child. Perhaps it was unfair, perhaps it was unnecessary, but something deep inside him wanted to know. Would this boy, raised in modest conditions, resist temptation if given the chance, or would he give in like so many adults he had known? That thought refused to leave his mind. So he decided to create a test. The billionaire had a large safe in his office room. It was no ordinary safe. It was big enough to store stacks of money, gold coins, and documents that could change the fate of companies. Normally, the safe was locked tight, hidden behind a painting. But today, he left it wide open. Bundles of $100 bills lay stacked neatly. Golden coins glimmered in the light. It was a sight that could make any person's heart race. He leaned back in his chair and let his body sink into the soft leather. Then he closed his eyes, pretending to sleep. His breathing slowed down, his face relaxed, and to anyone watching, he looked like a man lost in peaceful rest. But inside he was alert. He was watching with his ears, ready to hear the smallest sound of movement near the safe. Minutes passed. The maid went about her work quietly, dusting shelves and wiping the table. She told her son to sit and wait. The boy, curious and restless, walked slowly around the room. His eyes scanned the large bookshelves, the grand desk, and finally, the open safe. The billionaire, though pretending to be asleep, could sense where the boy's attention had landed. His heart quickened slightly. This was the moment. The boy froze for a moment, staring at the shining coins and the thick bundles of cash. He looked back at his mother, who was busy in another corner, not watching him. Then he looked at the man in the chair, who seemed to be sleeping peacefully. No one was watching him. No one would know. The billionaire's mind began racing. He had seen adults, fully grown and educated, fail such a test. He remembered a former partner who had taken advantage of him, stealing money while pretending to be a friend. He remembered employees who faked loyalty until a bigger paycheck pulled them away. Would a child be any different? The boy slowly walked toward the safe. His little steps echoed in the billionaire's ears like thunder. Each step felt heavier than the last. He stopped in front of the open door, staring inside. His small hands twitched slightly as if tempted to reach out. The billionaire's heart was pounding. The boy leaned in closer. The smell of paper money filled his nose. The gold coins seemed to shine even brighter under the light. His young mind must have been racing, imagining toys, games, food, and things he had never had before. All he had to do was reach out and take it. The billionaire, though still pretending, was frozen with tension. He was ready to see the truth about this boy. He wanted to know if innocence was real or if temptation corrupted even the youngest heart. The boy lifted his hand. For a second, the billionaire thought he was about to grab a stack of bills. He almost opened his eyes, ready to confront him. But then something happened. The boy pulled out a small yellow cleaning glove from his pocket. He slipped it onto his hand and slowly wiped the edge of the safe door, brushing off the dust that had gathered there. Then with careful hands he pushed the heavy door closed. The sound of the metal lock echoed in the quiet room. The billionaire felt a wave of surprise wash over him. The boy had not taken anything. Instead, he had cleaned the safe and closed it. The boy then walked back to the chair where the billionaire sat. He picked up a blanket that had slipped onto the floor and carefully draped it over the billionaire's shoulders. He stood for a moment as if making sure the man was comfortable, then quietly walked away. The billionaire's chest tightened. His heart, hardened by years of betrayal and mistrust, softened for the first time in years. He had expected greed. He had expected weakness. But instead he had witnessed something pure. He kept his eyes shut, afraid that if he opened them too soon, the boy might know he had been tested. But inside he was frozen with shock, frozen with guilt, and frozen with admiration. For the first time in a very long time, the billionaire felt something rare, hope. The office was filled with silence after the boy had walked away from the safe. The billionaire sat with his eyes closed, pretending to sleep, but his mind was very much awake. He replayed every second of what had just happened. The boy had stood before a mountain of wealth, enough money to change his family's life overnight, and yet he had not taken a single dollar. Instead, he had chosen to close the safe and cover a man he believed to be sleeping with a blanket. That single act echoed loudly in the billionaire's heart, louder than the sound of money, louder than any words he had heard in his boardrooms or meetings. But the test was not yet over, not in his mind. He wanted to push further, to see what more the boy would do if temptation kept knocking at his young heart. The boy wandered back toward the bookshelves, his small fingers running across the spines of thick volumes filled with stories of history, success, and power. He could not read all the heavy titles, but the weight of the books fascinated him. He turned back to glance at his mother, who was now in another part of the house polishing silver. She trusted him enough to let him explore. The boy's eyes drifted once more toward the safe. Though closed, he knew what lay inside. Money, golden coins, treasures his family had never owned. He had grown up in a small apartment where his mother worked long hours to keep food on the table. There were nights when he wanted new shoes for school, but had to make do with the old ones. There were days when he longed for a toy he had seen in a shop window, but his mother's tired smile reminded him to be grateful for what little they had. The boy felt the weight of those memories pressing on him as he stood in the grand office. Here was a chance, an open door to a world that his mother had never known. He knew the man in the chair was rich beyond imagination. The house itself was proof. The boy thought for a moment what it would mean if he took even one bundle of money. His mother would not have to work so hard. He could have clothes that were new, food that was more than enough, toys that other kids in his school bragged about. He could erase the tired look from his mother's face. The thought made his small heart race. But then another voice whispered inside him. It was his mother's voice, soft yet firm, the kind that guided him every day. She had always told him that honesty was more valuable than anything money could buy. She had told him that a person could lose everything in life, but if they still held their character, they had not truly lost. Her words played in his mind like a shield. He walked closer to the safe again as though drawn to it, but he did not open it. He touched the cold steel door gently and whispered under his breath, "Not mine." The billionaire, still pretending, felt his throat tighten. He could not hear the exact words, but he sensed the boy's decision in the way he stood there. He saw how long the boy lingered near temptation, fighting a silent battle only he could fight. Adults often lost such battles. Many who sat in his office across polished desks had made choices driven by greed. Yet here was a child, poor and without privilege, choosing respect over selfishness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The boy finally stepped back and looked at the billionaire again. To him, the man was just a sleeping figure, someone powerful yet fragile enough to need covering with a blanket. The boy's small act of kindness was not a performance, not something done for reward, but something that came naturally to him. His eyes softened as he adjusted the blanket more neatly over the billionaire's shoulders, tucking it carefully the way his mother sometimes tucked him in at night. He then sat quietly on the edge of a chair near the bookshelf. He did not complain about boredom, nor did he disturb his mother. Instead, he picked up a small notebook lying on the desk. It was blank, meant for scribbles or notes. The boy pulled out a pencil from his pocket and began to draw. He drew clumsy shapes of houses, cars, and smiling faces. His imagination turned the empty pages into dreams. He drew his mother with a smile. He drew himself standing tall, and without realizing it, he drew something that looked like a tall building, as though he were creating a vision of a future far beyond the tiny apartment he lived in now. The billionaire opened his eyes slightly, just enough to see the boy's small hand move across the paper. Something stirred inside him. He saw in that child the version of himself he had lost long ago. A boy with big dreams, a boy who wanted to build something, but had nothing to start with except hope and determination. For a brief moment, the billionaire's chest ached as if the boy's presence was reminding him of what truly mattered before money and mistrust clouded his life. The temptation was still there, heavy and glowing behind the steel door, but the boy no longer looked at it. His focus had shifted to the paper, to imagination, to something far more valuable than stolen riches. In those scribbles he found escape, and in that escape he found contentment. When his mother returned to the room, she glanced at him and smiled softly. She saw the drawing and placed a gentle hand on his head, pride shining in her eyes. She did not know about the test, nor did she see the open safe, but she saw her son, choosing to spend his time in innocence rather than trouble. She whispered, "Good boy," and went back to her chores. The billionaire felt the words pierce his heart. He knew the boy had passed the temptation he had laid before him. Not only passed, but had done so with a grace that even grown men lacked. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt his guarded heart begin to melt. He wondered, was it possible that in this child's honesty lay a lesson he himself had forgotten? The boy leaned back in the chair, humming softly, his pencil still moving on the page. The safe sat closed, untouched, its treasures still intact. The billionaire sat frozen in thought, realizing that he had not tested the boy, but the boy had tested him. And in that moment, the boy had won. The sun had begun to dip lower outside. The tall windows of the mansion, its fading light stretching across the wooden floor of the office. The billionaire still sat in his chair with his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady, but inside he was wide awake. He had witnessed the boy resist temptation not once but twice, and yet he wanted to see more. He wanted to know if what he had seen was a moment of luck, a passing choice, or if it was truly a reflection of the child's heart. The safe had been left open on purpose, a door to temptation waiting like a trap, and yet the boy had chosen to close it. That single act had already changed something inside the billionaire, but his curiosity had not yet been satisfied. He wanted to see what the boy would do when the test no longer seemed like a test, when the choice would feel heavier and lonelier. The boy continued to sit near the bookshelf, drawing in the blank notebook. His small hands moved quickly, sketching figures that only a child could imagine. He drew his mother smiling. He drew himself standing in front of a tall building. And he drew a strange mix of shapes that looked like towers reaching for the sky. The drawings were messy, uneven, but there was a fire in the boy's eyes. It was the fire of someone who dreamed beyond the walls of his reality. He looked at the billionaire again, and then back at his paper. In his mind, he wondered what it might feel like to be so rich, to own a house so big, to have a safe filled with money and gold. For a moment his heart ached with longing. The billionaire could sense the longing from where he sat. He remembered that feeling from his own youth, the hunger that never left until he built his empire. He knew how powerful that hunger could be, how it could push someone toward greatness or drag them down into greed. He watched the boy, and once again he felt the ache of his own past. The boy stood up slowly and walked toward the safe again. The billionaire stiffened under his blanket, though he kept his eyes shut. The boy placed his small hand on the cold, metal door and whispered to himself words so soft the billionaire barely caught them. "It is not mine." He pulled away again, shaking his head gently, almost as if reminding himself of the promise his mother had planted in him. His little face showed the struggle. He was young, and the temptation was real, but his choice was stronger. Instead of opening the safe, the boy turned his attention back to the billionaire. He walked quietly to the chair, studied the man's resting face, and then picked up the blanket that had slipped slightly. He tucked it neatly once more and adjusted the chair cushion, trying to make the man more comfortable. Then, as if guided by a kindness that came naturally, the boy went to the side table and poured a glass of water from a jug. He placed it carefully within reach of the billionaire. It was such a small gesture, yet it carried more weight than gold. The billionaire's heart softened further. He had expected the boy to fail, to prove his suspicions about people right once again. Yet the child had done the opposite. Not only had he resisted temptation, but he had chosen to give instead of take, to serve instead of steal. The billionaire had built his life around testing others, exposing their weakness, protecting his fortune. But here was a boy who had nothing, and yet was rich in character, richer in ways that money could not measure. The boy went back to his seat and picked up the pencil again. He began to write letters under his drawings, though many of them were crooked and uneven. He wrote words like home, mom, and dream. He wrote slowly, carefully, as though each word mattered. When his mother entered the room once more, she glanced at his scribbles and gave him a smile that lit up her tired face. She praised him softly, and the boy looked at her with eyes full of love. The billionaire's chest grew heavy. He had seen wealth in many forms, banks, markets, skyscrapers, but he realized in that quiet moment that true wealth was in the bond between this boy and his mother, in the honesty that lived in their small actions. He remembered how his own family bonds had faded as he climbed the ladder of success. The higher he went, the more distant he became from the simple warmth of kindness. Now, watching the Maid's son, he felt a longing for something he had lost long ago. The boy stood once more and walked near the safe. This time he bent down and wiped away the dust that clung to its lower edge, using his small hands as if cleaning it was his duty. He straightened up, glanced back at his mother, then looked at the billionaire. The man's eyes were still shut, but in truth they were moist. He was frozen not by fear but by a strange kind of admiration. He had wanted to expose dishonesty, but instead, he had uncovered honesty so deep, it humbled him. The room grew quieter as the minutes passed. The boy returned to his chair, resting his head on his arms, still humming a soft tune. His innocence filled the space with a peace the billionaire had not felt in years. He had entered this test expecting disappointment, yet he found himself being tested instead. The child's unexpected choice to honor honesty and kindness had pierced through the billionaire's walls of doubt. For the first time in a long while, he wondered if perhaps the greatest treasure he could ever hold was not in the safe, but in the lessons taught by a boy who had nothing yet gave everything. The billionaire sat frozen, knowing that this was only the beginning of what the boy was about to teach him. The house had grown quiet, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock that stood in the hallway. The billionaire sat still, in his chair, his eyelids heavy with the act of pretending to sleep, though his mind was racing with thoughts he could not escape. The boy's small actions replayed in his head over and over like echoes that refused to fade. He had expected greed, but instead he had seen patience. He had expected dishonesty, but instead he had seen care. He had expected a child to stumble, yet he had watched him walk with more dignity than many grown men. The weight of those moments was heavy on him, heavier than the billions locked away in his accounts. The boy had now settled quietly near the desk, still scribbling his drawings in the notebook. He glanced up now and then at his mother, who had moved to the far corner to finish her chores, and at the billionaire, who remained unmoving. To the boy, the man was only sleeping, but to the billionaire, the boy was a mirror showing him something he had forgotten about himself long ago. The boy hummed a small tune, his voice soft and almost fragile, filling the space with an innocence the mansion had not known in years. The billionaire, with his eyes barely closed, felt every note of that humming strike his heart like a gentle tap on a locked door. As time moved on, the boy noticed the blanket slipping again from the billionaire's shoulder. Without hesitation, he rose from his seat and carefully tucked it back into place. He even adjusted the armrest cushion, his hands moving with a kindness that came naturally, not forced. Then, as though it was instinct, the boy placed the glass of water a little closer to the man's hand, ready for when he would wake. It was not wealth that guided those choices, but something deeper, an understanding that to care for someone else was worth more than taking something for himself. The billionaire had to hold his breath to keep from revealing his emotions. His chest rose and fell heavier than before, and for a moment he worried the boy might notice. He wondered how a child, who had so little in his own life, could choose to give instead of take. That thought stirred guilt deep inside him. He had surrounded himself with guards, lawyers, accountants, and advisors, but not one of them had shown him such small but genuine acts of kindness. And here was a boy, the son of his maid, who had walked into his office and done more to restore his faith in people than any business partner or so-called friend ever had. The boy looked back toward the safe once again, his young eyes drawn to the thought of what lay behind it. His hand twitched slightly, and for a moment he took a step toward it, but then he stopped. He stood still, thinking, almost whispering to himself. Though the billionaire could not hear the exact words, he saw the boy's lips move in quiet determination. The boy shook his head softly, as though answering a question no one else could hear. Then he walked back to his chair without touching the safe. It was as if he had closed not only the door of the safe, but also the door of temptation in his heart. The billionaire wanted to sit up, to speak, to tell the boy how much his choices meant. Yet he held back, frozen by something greater than surprise. He was witnessing something rare, something powerful, and he did not want to interrupt. He realized that his plan had changed. He had wanted to test the boy, but now it was he who was being tested. Every second that passed showed him a truth he had forgotten. That character cannot be measured by money, and loyalty cannot be bought with gold. The maid entered once again, glancing at her son with tired but proud eyes. She saw the drawings, she saw the way he carried himself with quiet respect, and she smiled faintly. She did not know about the safe, she did not know about the test, but she knew her son. She had raised him to believe that hard work was honorable, and that honesty was worth more than riches. In her eyes, she had already succeeded, for her son was proof of her teachings. The billionaire watched the exchange from behind closed eyelids. The bond between mother and son struck him harder than any business deal he had ever closed. He realized that his billions had bought him walls, distance, and suspicion, but not the warmth of such a bond. That realization cut deep. He had traded too much for his empire, and the cost had been higher than money. The boy continued to draw quietly, sometimes pausing to glance at the billionaire, sometimes looking at his mother. The humming continued, soft and steady, a sound that filled the silence with life. Each note seemed to say more than words could. Each action the boy took without expecting reward was like a lesson unfolding before the billionaire's eyes. He wanted to speak, but his throat tightened. He wanted to move, but his body stayed still. He was frozen not by fear, but by the weight of what he was witnessing. The minutes dragged on, but to the billionaire they felt like a moment carved out of eternity. The boy's refusal to take what was not his quiet acts of kindness, and the pure bond he shared with his mother, had struck something inside the man that no fortune, no achievement, no luxury had ever touched. He realized that the test he had created was revealing not the boy's heart, but his own emptiness. For the first time in years he felt ashamed, not of his wealth, but of how little he had valued the richness of integrity and compassion. As the boy leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, drifting into a light nap, the billionaire felt a lump rise in his throat. He could no longer deny it. He had set a trap, but he was the one caught. He had pretended to sleep, but now he felt awake in a way he had not been in decades. He had wanted to expose dishonesty, but instead he had been shown honesty so bright it froze him where he sat. The silent witness had seen enough. The boy had made his choice, and it was not the one the billionaire had expected. The weight of silence in the office grew heavier as the evening shadows lengthened across the polished floor. The billionaire could no longer keep still. For hours he had pretended to be asleep, his mind torn between disbelief and admiration at what he had witnessed. He had expected to see a child reach for easy wealth, but instead he had seen honesty win again and again. The boy had resisted temptation not once, not twice, but every single time the thought arose. He had shown respect, kindness, and self-control beyond his years. The billionaire's chest tightened as though something was breaking inside him. He could not carry the silence any longer. Slowly he opened his eyes and let his heavy voice break the stillness of the room. "Come here, boy," he said. The boy startled. His pencil slipped from his fingers and rolled across the desk. His mother turned quickly, her hands frozen over the silverware she had been polishing. The boy stood hesitantly, his small body stiff with uncertainty. then walked slowly toward the leather chair where the billionaire sat upright for the first time all day. His heart raced. Had he done something wrong? Had he broken a rule? The man's deep gaze unsettled him, for it was not the gaze of someone waking gently from rest. It was sharp, searching, almost heavy with something unspoken. The billionaire studied the boy in silence for a long moment. His eyes lingered on the child's face, the notebook clutched nervously in his hands, the faint smudges of pencil on his small fingers. He thought of the open safe, of the money untouched, of the blanket neatly placed on his shoulders, of the glass of water carefully positioned. He thought of the whispered words he had half heard, of the boy shaking his head in quiet refusal, of the bond he shared with his mother. Each image replayed in his mind like scenes in a story he could not forget. Finally, the billionaire spoke again, his voice low but firm. "Why did you not take it?" The boy looked at him with wide eyes, unsure how to answer. He shifted on his feet and lowered his gaze to the ground. "Take what, sir?" he asked softly, though he knew exactly what the man meant. The billionaire leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The money," he said. "The safe was open. No one was watching you. You could have taken anything you wanted. Why did you not?" The boy's throat went dry. His hands clutched the notebook tighter, and for a moment he feared he was in trouble. But then his mother's voice rang in his mind once again, her words as clear as if she had spoken them beside him. "We do not take what is not ours. We work for what we need. We hold our heads high, even when life is hard." With courage slowly building, the boy raised his eyes to meet the billionaire's. His voice trembled at first, but then it grew steadier. "Because it is not mine," he said. "My mother says if we want something, we must work for it. If I had taken your money, I would have been stealing. That would make me someone who cannot be trusted. I do not want to be that person." The billionaire froze. The words hit him harder than any deal lost, harder than any betrayal he had ever faced. He had been searching for truth, for loyalty, for proof that honesty still existed in a world poisoned by greed, and now it had come from the lips of a child. He felt a sting in his eyes, one he had not felt in decades. His vision blurred and he blinked quickly, trying to hide the tears threatening to fall. The boy's mother stepped forward quickly, alarmed by the conversation. "Sir, if my son has done something to upset you, please forgive him," she said. Her voice carried both fear and dignity. "He is young, but he knows right from wrong. I have tried to raise him that way." The billionaire turned his gaze toward her, and for the first time she saw not suspicion or authority in his eyes, but something softer, something vulnerable. He shook his head slowly. "Your son has not upset me," he said. "He has done the opposite." He looked back at the boy and let out a long breath. "You had a choice," he continued. "A choice that many grown men have failed. You could have taken what was not yours and no one would have known. But you chose honesty instead. Do you know how rare that is?" The boy shook his head. "It is just what is right," he replied simply. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his chest heavy with emotions he could no longer hide. He remembered partners who had lied to his face, employees who had stolen behind his back, friends who had left him the moment money no longer flowed their way. And yet here was a boy, poor and with nothing, who had shown him a kind of wealth that none of them had possessed. For a long moment the billionaire said nothing. His eyes shifted from the boy to the mother and then back again. He realized this was no ordinary moment. It was a turning point, one that demanded more than silence. Slowly he stood from his chair, his tall frame towering over both of them, but his eyes softened as he looked at the child. "You remind me of someone I once was," he said quietly. "A boy who had nothing but dreams, a boy who wanted more than the world gave him. Somewhere along the way I lost that part of myself. I surrounded myself with walls, with money, with suspicion. But today you reminded me what matters. You reminded me that wealth without honesty is nothing." The boy listened quietly, his young mind trying to absorb the weight of the words. His mother's eyes glistened with tears she tried to hide. She had never seen her employer speak in such a way, with such raw truth. The billionaire placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "I set a trap for you," he admitted. "I pretended to sleep and left my safe open. I wanted to see what you would do, and you showed me something I thought no longer existed." The boy blinked, his lips parting in surprise. He had not known he was being tested. He had not realized that every small decision he had made, every time he chose honesty over temptation, was being watched. His heart beat faster, but his voice was steady when he answered, "I only did what my mother taught me." The billionaire turned to the maid, his eyes filled with respect. "Then you have raised your son better than many who call themselves rich," he said. "You have given him a gift that money cannot buy. And because of that, I cannot let this moment end without doing something in return." The mother's knees weakened and she lowered her gaze. Overwhelmed, the boy looked up at the billionaire with wide eyes, waiting for his next words. The room seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls themselves were listening. The air inside the room felt heavy after the billionaire's words. The boy stood silently, his small shoulders stiff, still holding the notebook in his hand as though it was a shield against the moment. His mother's chest rose and fell quickly. The cloth she had been holding now crumpled in her fingers. She had worked for this man for years, always careful, always respectful, never daring to step out of place. And now, here was her son standing before the wealthiest man she had ever known, being spoken to as though he were the most important person in the room. The billionaire's eyes softened as he looked at the boy again. His voice, usually sharp with command, was now slower, almost trembling with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for years. "Do you know what honesty has given you today?" he asked. The boy frowned in confusion, shaking his head. He thought of his mother's lessons, of nights when she whispered to him about being good even when no one was watching, of mornings when she told him that their life was hard but their dignity was untouchable. To him, honesty was not a prize to be won but a rule to be followed. It had never occurred to him that his simple choice would carry such weight. The billionaire turned his gaze to the maid. "You have raised him well," he said. "You have given him something more valuable than anything in my safe. I have seen men with millions fail when temptation called, but your son with nothing turned away. That tells me something about his future." Tears welled in the mother's eyes. She lowered her head, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Thank you, sir. I have tried to teach him the only way I know, through hard work, through truth, through faith." The billionaire nodded, then straightened his posture. His voice grew firmer, though it carried warmth. "From this day forward, I will take responsibility for his education. Every book he needs, every fee, every opportunity, I will provide it. He will not struggle for the things I can give him. His honesty deserves a future as big as his dreams." The boy's eyes widened. He could barely believe the words. For years he had watched other children talk about their schools, their new clothes, their summer camps, while he quietly accepted the limits of his life. Now here was a man promising to open doors he had only dared to draw in his notebook. His heart pounded, not from greed but from a sudden rush of hope. The mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears sliding down her cheeks. She had worked in this house scrubbing floors and polishing silver, often wondering if her son's future would be trapped by the same walls of struggle she had known. To hear these words felt like watching the impossible come alive. She dropped to her knees without thinking, but the billionaire reached forward quickly and stopped her. "No," he said firmly. "Stand, you do not bow to me. You have already given me something no one else could, the proof that goodness still exists." The maid rose slowly, her hands shaking, her heart too full for words. She looked at her son, whose face glowed with wonder, and then back at her employer, whose eyes carried a sincerity she had never seen before. The billionaire continued, his voice steadier now. "I will not only fund his schooling. When the time comes, I will ensure he has a place in one of my companies. I want him to see the world beyond these walls. I want him to know that honesty is noticed, that integrity is rewarded." The boy clutched the notebook tighter. "Sir," he whispered, his voice fragile with emotion, "I did not do it for a reward. I only did what my mother said was right." The billionaire's chest tightened. He felt something inside him break apart. Years of suspicion, bitterness, and cold calculation crumbling under the weight of a child's pure words. He reached out and placed a hand gently on the boy's head. "That is why you deserve it even more," he said. "Because you did not choose honesty for gain, you chose it because it is who you are. That is a rare treasure in this world." For a long moment the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. The boy stood with his head bowed, the billionaire's hand resting firmly but gently on him, his mother watching with tears still streaming down her face. It was not the kind of scene anyone could have predicted, not the kind of ending that usually followed a test of greed. It was something greater, something that felt like a quiet miracle inside the walls of a house built on money but now filled with truth. The billionaire pulled back slowly, and walked to the safe. He opened it wide, letting the light from the setting sun hit the stacks of bills and coins. The boy's eyes followed the movement, but his small body did not move forward. The billionaire turned back to him. "Do you see all this?" he asked. The boy nodded carefully. "All of this means nothing," the man said softly. "It can build houses, buy cars, create power. But it cannot buy honesty. It cannot buy loyalty. It cannot buy peace. Today you have shown me that the wealth in this room is worth less than the wealth in your heart." The boy did not fully understand the depth of those words, but he felt their weight. He saw the man's face change, softer now, kinder, almost humbled. He understood that the billionaire was not speaking about money anymore, but about something larger, something invisible. The mother wiped her tears and stepped closer. "Sir," she whispered, "you do not have to do this. We will manage. I do not want you to feel obliged." The billionaire shook his head firmly. "This is not obligation. This is gratitude. Your son reminded me of something I lost long ago. I cannot ignore that. I will not." The boy stood frozen, the notebook still pressed to his chest. He thought of the tall buildings he had drawn, the smiling faces, the dreams that seemed far away. For the first time, those dreams did not feel impossible. They felt close, as though they were waiting for him just beyond the horizon. The billionaire closed the safe with a heavy clang, turned the key and slipped it into his pocket. Then he looked at the boy once more. "One day," he said, "you will understand what this moment means. Until then, remember only this: never trade your honesty for anything. It is the only treasure that grows as you share it, the only wealth that cannot be stolen." The boy nodded slowly, his young face serious, his eyes shining with something new: pride, hope, and an understanding deeper than his years. The billionaire felt his heart ease for the first time in decades. He had planned a test, but it had become a lesson. He had thought to catch a boy in temptation, but instead he had been caught by truth. As the evening shadows deepened, the house no longer felt like a prison of wealth. It felt alive, filled with the light of something far more valuable than gold. The night had long settled over the city when the billionaire finally sat alone in his study, the boy and his mother having gone home after finishing their work. The mansion, usually silent in a way that felt empty, now carried an unfamiliar warmth. The billionaire rested in his chair, the same chair where he had pretended to sleep earlier that day, and let his thoughts wander back through every detail of what had happened. The image of the boy standing before the open safe lingered in his mind, as vivid as though it were still happening. He had seen hesitation, yes, but he had also seen resolve. He had seen temptation press against innocence and innocence push it back with quiet strength. And then he had seen something even greater: the boy choosing kindness, covering a stranger with a blanket, offering water, drawing dreams instead of reaching for stolen riches. That day had left a mark deeper than any business victory or any fortune gained. In the weeks that followed, the billionaire kept his word. He arranged for the boy to attend the best schools, ensuring that every cost was covered. He met with the teachers himself, explaining that the boy was not to be treated as a charity case but as a child with immense potential. The boy, shy at first in the new environment, soon began to shine. His drawings turned into essays. His quiet curiosity turned into questions, and his dreams began to take shape with clearer edges. The billionaire, who had once measured success only in profits, now measured it in the boy's progress. Each report card brought him a strange joy he had never known, as if he were rediscovering fatherhood he had lost years ago. The maid, too, carried herself differently. Her shoulders seemed lighter, her tired eyes brighter. She worked with the same dedication as before, but now she worked knowing her son's future was no longer chained to poverty. Often she would whisper prayers of gratitude when no one was listening. She had asked for nothing, yet she had been given more than she ever dreamed. The billionaire began spending more time with the boy. At first it was casual conversations. How was school? What books was he reading? What new things had he learned? But slowly those talks grew deeper. He began to share stories of his own struggles, of the hunger that had driven him when he was young, of the mistakes that had hardened him, of the betrayals that had built his walls. The boy listened intently, his young face serious, his questions sharp. Sometimes he would ask, "But why didn't you forgive them? Or why didn't you trust again?" And the billionaire would fall silent, realizing he had no answer that satisfied even himself. Years rolled by, and the boy grew into a young man. His posture grew taller, his words more confident, yet he never lost the humility and honesty that had defined him as a child. He excelled in school, not because everything came easily, but because he worked harder than most. The billionaire often watched him from a distance, struck by how the boy carried himself. There was a steadiness in him, a clarity that others lacked. It reminded the billionaire of what he had once been before money clouded his vision. By the time the boy reached university, the billionaire was no longer the same man he had been on that day of the test. He still ran his empire, still commanded respect in boardrooms, but his heart had softened. He trusted again, not blindly but wisely. He gave more generously, not for tax benefits or reputation, but because he had come to believe that real wealth was measured by what you gave, not what you kept. The boy had not only earned an education, he had restored something in the billionaire that he had thought was gone forever. The young man graduated with honors, his mother sitting proudly in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she clapped until her hands ached. The billionaire sat beside her, his usually stern face breaking into a smile that others barely recognized. He clapped too, not as a man clapping for someone else's achievement, but as a man celebrating his own redemption. In the years that followed, the young man joined the billionaire's company, not through favoritism but through merit. He started small, working harder than anyone, earning respect at every step. Employees whispered about him, noting his fairness, his honesty, and his refusal to cut corners. Some said he reminded them of the billionaire in his younger days, but those who knew the full story whispered that he was something even greater, a man shaped not only by ambition but by character. The billionaire often found himself telling the story of that day to trusted friends, sometimes in private gatherings, sometimes at public events. He would describe how he had pretended to sleep, how he had left his safe open, how he had expected to witness weakness but instead had been shown strength. He would pause at the part where the boy whispered to himself, "It is not mine," his voice thick with emotion even years later, and he would always end with the same words. "That day I set a trap, but I was the one who was caught." He showed me that honesty still exists, and that was the greatest fortune I ever gained. As the billionaire grew older, his empire remained, but his priorities shifted. He created scholarships in the boy's name, funding education for countless children who, like him, came from nothing but carried dreams larger than their circumstances. He invested not just in businesses but in people, in communities, in futures that money alone could not secure. And every time he signed a check or cut a ribbon, he thought of the boy standing before the safe, refusing what was not his. The boy, now a man, never forgot his mother's teachings or the lesson that one day in the mansion had etched into his soul. He led with honesty, with compassion, and with a vision that reached far beyond himself. And though he had gained wealth, he never let it define him. He often told younger employees the same words his mother had told him. "You can lose everything, but if you keep your character, you have lost nothing." In the quiet of his final years, the billionaire would sometimes sit in that same leather chair, now older and more worn, and watch the young man he had once tested walk through the halls of his company with confidence and respect. He would smile not at the fortune he had built, but at the legacy he had passed on, a legacy not of money, but of honesty, of integrity, of hope. And when people asked him what his greatest investment had ever been, he never spoke of stocks or real estate or global deals. He would simply say, "It was the day I pretended to sleep and watched a boy make a choice that changed us both." That choice became the story he carried until his last breath. A story that reminded everyone who heard it that wealth is not in what you hold in your hands, but in what you carry in your heart.